I went to school out of state, so I only got to see my family on holidays and in the summer. After I graduated, I got a job not far from where I grew up, and I was happy about that. Reconnecting with family was important to me, and it wasn't long before things were right back to the way they were. Around that time, my parents bought a cabin, and they told me I could use it whenever I wanted. It was about 10 miles from the nearest town, and it was in the woods. It had an old dock on a lake, but it was winter when this happened, so it was frozen at the time. I had been there a few times in the summer, but never in the colder months. When I mentioned it to my friend Paul, he thought it sounded like a great trip, so he agreed to go out with me. The drive took about 3 hours, which included a detour to get Paul. The first half was on the highway, but once we turned off onto the back roads, we had to go slower. The snow had been light at first, but by the time we got to the unpaved road that led to the cabin, it was thick on the ground. My truck handled it fine, but I had to take it slow. The last stretch of road was lined with tall, snow-covered pines, their branches heavy with fresh snowfall. There were no other houses along that road, just trees and more trees. By the time we pulled up, it was completely dark, except for the glow of my truck's headlights. The cabin was small and simple, with a wraparound porch and a pitched roof. It had been there for decades, but my parents had done some renovations, mostly fixing up the inside. The air was bitterly cold, and when I stepped out, I could hear the wind moving through the trees. Other than that, it was completely silent. We carried in some supplies, which included enough food to last us a week, which was longer than we planned to stay. There was also a couple of flashlights and extra firewood, even though my parents had plenty stacked against the side of the house. The inside of the cabin was just as I remembered it from before. It had wood-paneled walls, old furniture, and a thick rug in the center of the room. The back door led to the lake, which was frozen over this time of year. I got a fire going while Paul looked around. He had never been there before, but he seemed to like it. "This place is nice," he said, setting his bag down near the couch. "Feels kind of isolated, though." "Yeah, it is," I said. We stayed up for a while, talking and drinking a couple of beers. It was nice to get away from everything, and the fire kept the cabin warm. At some point, I glanced out the window and saw that it was snowing heavily. The wind had picked up, and it was piling up fast. I figured we'd be fine as long as we didn't get completely snowed in. Then we went to bed at around midnight. The next morning, I stepped outside and was hit with a blast of cold air. The snow was deep, but I still wanted to go out and explore a bit. Paul was still sleeping, but I decided to go out for a bit. I put on my boots and stepped out onto the porch. The snow was up to my knees once I got a few steps away from the cabin, and that was when I noticed another set of footprints out there. They led straight to the front porch, stopping just a few feet from the door. At first, I thought maybe they were mine or Paul's from the night before, but they were too fresh. With how much snow had fallen, any old tracks would have been buried. I walked around the cabin, checking for anything else, but I didn't see anything unusual. Paul came out a few minutes later, and when I showed him the tracks, he just shook his head. "That's weird," he said. Up until then, I was still hoping that he had gotten up early and gone out, but he said that he hadn't. Neither of us could explain it, but there wasn't much we could do. We tried not to think about it and went about our day as planned. After breakfast, we put on our snowshoes and set out on one of the trails. The snow was deep, but the shoes kept us from sinking too much. Every so often, a gust of wind would shake some snow from the trees, and it would fall in clumps around us. The trail led toward the lake, winding through thick trees. We didn't talk much at first, just took in the surroundings. Maybe it was just the footprints from earlier, but I felt like we weren't as alone as we should have been. After about an hour, we stopped for a break. Paul took a drink from his thermos and asked, "You think somebody was messing with us?" I knew he was talking about the footprints. "I don't think so. There's nobody out here." Paul seemed to agree with me, but he didn't look convinced. He wasn't the type to scare easily, and neither was I, but something felt wrong. Still, we'd planned this trip, and I wasn't going to let something so small ruin it. By noon, we reached the lake. The ice stretched in every direction with no tracks or cracks. In the summer, my parents had an old canoe tied to the dock, but now everything was frozen solid. We sat on a fallen log and had lunch, eating in silence for a while. But then, Paul looked up suddenly. What the hell? I turned to look where he was looking, and in the distance, a thick column of black smoke was pouring up in the sky. It was coming from the direction of the cabin. For a second, I didn't move. My first thought was the fireplace, but I knew that wasn't possible. I had put the fire out before we left, and even if some embers had still been hot, they wouldn't have created that much smoke. Not even a full fire would do that. Paul and I locked eyes, and neither of us said anything. Then we took off running. Moving through the deep snow was slow, even with the snowshoes. Every few minutes, I'd glance up, hoping the smoke had stopped, but it only got thicker. The run back took about half an hour, but it felt longer. When we reached the cabin, my worst fears were realized. It was burning. Flames had already torn through the roof, sending sparks into the air, and the porch was collapsing. There was no saving it. Paul stood next to me, breathing hard. What the hell happened? I shook my head. I don't know. By the time the fire burned down, nothing was left except for smoldering remains. The walls had collapsed, and the furniture was nothing but charred scraps. The fire had burned hot and fast, and it had taken everything. We didn't say much at first because it was too much to process. Finally, Paul broke the silence. That wasn't an accident. I already knew that, but I didn't want to admit it out loud. Even if somehow a spark from the fireplace had caught something, a fire wouldn't have spread like that on its own. Someone had set it. Luckily, I had parked the truck a safe distance from the cabin, so it wasn't burned. We went to it, and that was when I noticed something else. The driver's side window was shattered. It wasn't broken, but it had cracks spreading across the glass, like someone had hit it hard and given up. Then I looked at Paul and said, "We need to go." We got into the truck, and I started the engine. The tires crunched over the packed snow as I turned around. Then a few miles down the road, we saw someone walking. A man was in the middle of the road with no coat, no backpack or anything. The guy was wearing a flannel shirt with his arms clasped in front of him, like he was huddling for warmth. Then as soon as he saw us in the truck, he ran into the woods. I didn't care who he was, and I just kept driving. When we got into town, I pulled over and called my parents. They were upset about the cabin, but they were mostly just relieved that we were okay. I didn't know what to tell them about the footprints, the fire, or the man on the road. None of it made sense, and I didn't think it ever would. After that trip, I never wanted to go back to that area again. A few years ago, I took a road trip by myself to visit family on the East Coast. It was the summer after I graduated from college, and since I didn't have a job yet, I couldn't afford to fly. That's why I was driving my old car, even though I wasn't sure it would hold up for the whole trip. I had already been dealing with minor issues, like the air conditioning cutting out and a weird rattling sound that started whenever I hit 60 miles per hour. I told myself it would make it, but I was looking forward to getting a new car once I started making money. I had mapped out the whole trip ahead of time. The plan was to take the interstates and stick to well-traveled routes, but after the first day, I got bored and decided to take some side roads. I figured it would be more interesting to see the less traveled parts of the country, and since I didn't have to be anywhere at a specific time, I thought I might as well take my time. By the second evening, I was in rural Indiana when the weather took a bad turn. The sky had been cloudy all day, but I hadn't thought much of it. Then at around 6 in the evening, heavy rain started coming down, and within minutes, I could barely see the road. My windshield wipers were going as fast as they could, but they weren't helping much. I slowed down and kept going, hoping I would pass through the storm quickly. I checked my phone to see where the nearest town was, but I didn't have service. That made me a little uneasy, especially since I didn't know exactly where I was. I had been relying on my GPS, but without a signal, I had no idea if I was even going in the right direction. I thought about turning back, but I didn't want to deal with that rain any longer than I had to. It was already getting dark, and I didn't want to risk breaking down in the middle of nowhere. I kept driving, but I was really looking for somewhere to stop for the night. It was almost completely dark by the time I saw a flickering neon sign in the distance. As I got closer, I saw that it was an old roadside motel, and the sign said vacancy in red letters. It didn't look like much, but at that point, I just wanted to get off the road. I pulled into the small parking lot and saw only 2 other cars there. One was an older-looking station wagon that looked like it hadn't been driven in a long time. The other was a newer pickup truck, parked closer to the office. I pulled into a spot on the far side of the lot and turned off the engine. The storm was still going strong, and I could hear the rain hammering against the roof. I grabbed my bag, then swung open the door and made a run for the office. As soon as I opened the door, I noticed that there was a broken window on the side of the building. There was shattered glass on the floor, and the curtains were flapping from the wind blowing in through the opening. The inside of the office smelled damp, like old carpet mixed with cigarette smoke. I hesitated for a second, but stepped inside anyway, only to get out of the rain. The desk at the front had one of those old-fashioned bells on it, so I tapped it and waited, but nothing happened. I looked around and saw a hallway behind the counter leading to what I assumed was the manager's office. The door was open, and from where I stood, I could see that the desk inside was a mess. Papers were scattered everywhere, and a chair was tipped over. It looked like someone had left in a hurry, or maybe something worse had happened. That was enough for me. I wasn't about to stick around and find out what was going on. I turned and walked quickly back to the door. When I stepped outside, the rain had let up slightly, but it was still coming down hard enough that I had to shield my face as I ran back to my vehicle. Just as I got to my car, I noticed two sets of headlights coming down the highway toward the motel. The cars slowed down as they got closer, then both turned into the parking lot. Something about it made me uneasy, because the timing was too perfect. It's like they had been waiting for something. I quickly unlocked my door, got inside, and started the engine. I didn't even bother putting my seatbelt on before throwing it into reverse and backing out. I was about to pull onto the road when one of the approaching cars, a dark-colored Ford, suddenly turned and blocked the exit. I barely had time to register what was happening before I saw the driver's side window roll down. The man inside was bald, and even in the dim light, I could make out a dark tattoo on the top of his head. He stared at me for a second, then started opening his door. I spun the wheel and aimed my car toward the other side of the lot, where there was a small grass-covered barricade separating the parking lot from the highway. It wasn't much, just a low ridge of dirt and grass, but I didn't care. I hit the gas and drove right over it, the car jolting hard as I landed back on the wet pavement. My tires skidded for a second before they caught traction, and I sped off down the highway. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw one of the cars pulling out onto the road behind me. Its headlights stayed close for a while, not letting me gain any distance. I pressed the gas pedal as hard as I could, praying my car wouldn't give out. I drove like that for miles, with the guy following me, but eventually, the other car fell back. I didn't know if they had given up, or if I lost them somehow, but I wasn't going to slow down to find out. I kept driving through the night. By the time the storm cleared up, and I finally had service again, it was nearly morning. I pulled over just long enough to call the police and tell them about what happened. They said they would check it out, but I wasn't going back to that motel. I never found out what was going on there, and honestly, I didn't want to. I just kept driving until I was hours away, and even then, I didn't feel completely safe. I never took side roads on a long trip again. A few years ago, I was doing food deliveries for Uber. It was a decent way to make extra money, and for the most part, the job was easy. I had a full-time job already, but it paid only a little more than minimum wage, so I couldn't even afford an apartment with just that. I had my fair share of annoying customers. There were also long waits at restaurants and addresses that were hard to find, but nothing really scary happened until this one night. It was late on a Thursday night. I think it was around 9 p.m. I got a request for a large order from a barbecue place, and the drop-off spot was pretty far away. That usually means pretty good money, so I was happy to take the order. When I arrived at the restaurant, I realized just how big the order was. It was easily enough food for at least 10, maybe 15 people. It was so much that it took me 3 trips just to get everything into my car. I double-checked the receipt to make sure I had it all, then got back in and started my car. The address was outside of town, about 40 minutes away, in a more rural area. That wasn't too unusual. I'd done deliveries to people who lived on the outskirts before. Sometimes it was just a family that didn't want to cook, or a group having a get-together. For this order, though, I was expecting a decent-sized party. As I drove, though, the houses got farther apart, and the streetlights became less frequent. My GPS led me down a long, narrow dirt road, and I started to wonder what kind of place I was delivering to. When I finally reached the spot, I slowed down and looked around. There was a cabin up ahead, but it didn't look right. It was old-looking, and the windows were dark. There were no cars parked outside like I was expecting, so I wasn't sure if I was in the right place. There weren't any signs of a party or gathering. No music, no lights, nothing. I pulled into the dirt driveway and sat there for a moment. I checked the app to make sure I had the right address, and it matched. I figured maybe the people were inside, but the whole thing felt strange. I got out of the car and walked up to the front door, carrying the first load of food. I knocked, but there was no answer. Then I leaned in and looked through the window, but it was pitch black inside. At that point, I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to leave all this food sitting outside if nobody was going to get it, but I also didn't want to hang around too long. I set the food down on the porch and walked back to my car to send the customer a message. As I pulled out my phone, I heard a sound tapping on my window. I turned and saw a man standing there. He was tall, maybe in his early 40s, with glasses and a rough stubble of a beard. His expression was blank, and he stood too close to my window, just staring at me. I didn't want to, but I rolled it down slightly.
"You're the guy with the food?"
he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Are you the one who ordered?" He nodded but didn't make a move to take it.
"You need to help me carry it inside."
Like I said, the order was huge, way too much for just one person, and I hadn't seen or heard anyone else in the cabin. I glanced toward the house again, and it was still dark as night. The place looked abandoned. "I can't do that," I told him. "I can leave it here for you."
"You have to help,"
he said more forcefully. I shook my head. "I'm not allowed to enter customer homes. You can take it from here." That was when he started to look mad.
"You're being difficult,"
he snapped. Then, without warning, he slammed his fist against my car door. I jumped back, then rolled the window up quickly. He started shouting, pounding on the glass with his fists, so I threw the car into reverse. As I backed up, I heard a loud thud against my back window. I glanced in the mirror and saw him holding something, maybe a rock. I sped up and got down the driveway, kicking up gravel as I turned onto the main road. I checked my mirrors a few times, half expecting to see headlights following me, but the road behind me was empty. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town. I pulled into a gas station parking lot to catch my breath and call the cops. My back window had a visible crack, but at least it hadn't shattered. I grabbed my phone and immediately reported the customer through the Uber app. Then I drove home, still feeling rattled. I got an email from Uber the next day saying the user's account had been permanently deactivated, but that wasn't all. They also told me that the address I had been sent to didn't match the one registered to the account. Who had really placed the order, I don't know. Since my back window had a crack in it from whatever he threw, I decided to file a police report. When the cops looked into it, they found something even stranger. The house was empty. There was no sign of anyone living there. The actual owners were an older couple who hadn't been there in months, and they didn't match the description of the man I saw. The police checked with neighbors, but no one had seen anything unusual. There were no cameras nearby, and no other reports of suspicious activity. It was like the guy had just appeared out of nowhere and vanished afterward. My insurance covered the damage, and I kept working for Uber, but I was more cautious about rural deliveries after that. I never heard anything more about it, and eventually I moved on. But every so often, I think about what might have happened if I had stepped inside that cabin. In the summer of 2010, my Uncle Jacob bought a plot of land in an isolated part of the forest. It was in a great spot, but it needed a lot of work. There was no house on it, just a small cabin that looked more like a shed than anything else. Jacob had big plans for it, though, and he wanted to move out there eventually. He wanted to tear the cabin down and build something new that would be decent to actually live in. I wasn't too sure about it, but he had the money, so it wasn't my problem. I had just finished up school for the summer, so when he asked if I wanted to help him out with some of the work, I didn't mind. It was a pretty good deal for me. He'd pay me for helping out, and I'd get to spend the summer doing something other than sitting around at home. The land was about an hour and a half outside of town, and over 2 hours from where I was staying with my parents at the time. I liked it up there, and every weekend, Jacob and I would pack up the truck with camping gear, tools, and whatever else we thought we might need. We'd drive up to the land, set up camp, and spend the next couple of days clearing debris, chopping wood, and doing other small tasks around the area. It wasn't hard work, and it gave me a sense of accomplishment. Plus, I got paid for it, which made it feel even more worth it. Jacob wasn't much of a talker, but he was good company, and I liked spending time with him. We'd have meals around the campfire, and sometimes we'd sit there in silence for a while, just looking at the stars. The nights were cold, but the quiet and the solitude made it all feel peaceful. It wasn't like anything I was used to back home. There wasn't much in the way of excitement out there, but I didn't mind that. Sometimes, the best part of the weekend was when we'd finish up a task and relax with a beer. I hadn't expected to enjoy it as much as I did, but I grew to look forward to the weekends we spent there. One weekend, I was at home when Jacob called me. He told me he couldn't make it up to the property that weekend, and asked if I would go on my own to do some work. He said that if I went and did some clearing, he would still pay me for the day. It was a Saturday morning, and I didn't have anything else planned, so I figured I might as well go. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, just another weekend of work. When I got to the land, I noticed something weird. There was an old truck parked near the cabin. It was just an old beat-up pickup truck, and I didn't recognize it. I figured maybe Jacob had hired someone to help out with the work, so I drove over to see who it was. But when I got there, nobody was around. The truck was empty, and the cabin looked the same as it always did, run down and abandoned. I started to feel uneasy because it wasn't like there was much traffic out there, and the only people who knew about the place were Jacob and me. I decided to take a drive around the property. I circled the land a few times, checking the tree line and any areas that someone might hide. After about 20 minutes of driving around, I didn't find anything, so I grabbed my tools and started working. I was in the middle of clearing some debris near the cabin when I heard a shout. I turned around, and that's when I saw a man walking toward me. He was holding a rifle, and I froze for a second, not knowing what to do. The man looked angry, and he pointed the gun at me.
"You're trespassing on my land,"
he shouted. I knew this was my uncle's property, but I didn't argue with him. Instead, I held up my hands, trying to show him I wasn't a threat. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I didn't know anyone was here. I'll leave." He didn't lower the gun. In fact, it looked like he was getting angrier by the second. The rifle was aimed right at me, and I could see that his finger was on the trigger.
"Don't come back,"
he growled. I said that I wouldn't, and then slowly backed away. I didn't want to make any sudden moves, but I turned and got into my truck, trying to keep my cool. The whole thing felt surreal, and I'd never had a run-in like that before. Once I got to the town, I had cell service, so I called Jacob. I explained what happened, telling him about the truck and the man. He was as confused as I was, but he told me to stay put and that he'd be there as soon as he could. Right after he hung up, I called the police. It took a little while for them to get to the property, but when they did, they found the man still there. Jacob showed up not long after, and I filled him in on everything that had happened. From what I later heard, the man refused to leave when the police showed up. He even pointed his rifle at one of the officers, and it didn't take long for the situation to escalate. The police had no choice but to shoot him. Afterwards, I learned that the man had been living on the land for a while, and he'd been hiding out there without anyone knowing. No one knew his name or where he came from. He was clearly crazy, and I felt lucky that he let me go. Jacob didn't want to talk about it much, and I didn't know what to think. We never found out exactly what the man's problem was, but it was pretty intense knowing that we were out there with him all that time, without even knowing he was there.